Air Force Captain Madison Carter was traveling on a civilian airliner during her leave, sitting quietly in coach among 200 passengers who had no idea they were flying with one of the military's most skilled fighter pilots. When enemy missiles struck the aircraft over hostile territory, both pilots were severely injured and the plane's systems began failing catastrophically. "We're losing control of the aircraft," Captain Johnson radioed desperately as he and his co-pilot fought to keep the plane airborne. "Is anyone on board with aviation experience?" the flight attendant announced over the intercom. Madison looked at the terrified passengers around her, then at the cockpit where alarms were screaming. "I can help them fly it," she said calmly, making her way forward. What happened next would not only save 200 lives, but end her vacation permanently as she returned to active duty to hunt down the enemies who had tried to murder innocent civilians. The morning had started perfectly for Air Force Captain Madison Carter as she settled into seat 23C aboard United Airlines Flight 847, bound from Frankfurt to New York. After 18 months of consecutive deployments, flying F-16 Fighting Falcons in combat zones across the Middle East and Eastern Europe, Madison was finally taking the leave she had deferred repeatedly in favor of mission requirements. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, a simple sweater, and comfortable sneakers, nothing that would identify her as one of the Air Force's most experienced combat pilots. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail, and she carried only a small backpack containing the few personal items she'd brought for her 2-week vacation visiting family in California. Madison had earned her reputation through exceptional performance in some of the military's most challenging assignments. Her record included successful missions in contested airspace, multiple air-to-air intercepts, and combat operations that had earned her recognition as one of the Air Force's rising stars in fighter aviation. The passengers around her were typical for a transatlantic flight: business travelers working on laptops, families with children heading to Disney World, elderly couples on European vacations, and college students backpacking across continents. None of them had any reason to suspect that the quiet young woman in 23C had logged over 2,000 hours in military aircraft and had completed missions in some of the world's most dangerous airspace. Madison had chosen her seat deliberately, middle of the aircraft, away from windows, in a location that provided the best survival probability in case of emergency. Even on vacation, military training influenced every decision she made, though she hoped never to need the knowledge that had been drilled into her through years of combat operations. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain David Johnson speaking from the flight deck," came the announcement over the intercom. "We're currently cruising at 37,000 feet with clear skies ahead. Flight time to JFK International will be approximately 7 hours and 15 minutes. Madison settled back in her seat, planning to sleep through most of the flight. She had brought a book but found herself too exhausted from her most recent deployment to focus on reading. The past 6 months had been particularly intense, with her squadron conducting combat air patrols over Eastern European airspace in response to increased hostile activity from enemy forces. The mission had required constant vigilance, with pilots maintaining readiness to engage enemy aircraft that routinely tested NATO boundaries and challenged American air superiority. Madison had been involved in multiple intercepts, including several encounters with enemy fighters that had come dangerously close to escalating into full combat engagements. Her most recent mission had involved a particularly tense confrontation with enemy aircraft that had violated international airspace while conducting reconnaissance flights near American military installations. Madison's skill in de-escalating the situation while maintaining tactical advantage had earned commendation from senior leadership and reinforced her reputation as a pilot who could handle high-pressure situations with exceptional judgment. But now, 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, surrounded by civilian passengers on a routine commercial flight, Madison allowed herself to relax for the first time in months. The gentle hum of the Boeing 767's engines was soothing after the aggressive roar of F-16 afterburners, and she found herself drifting toward sleep as the aircraft maintained its steady course toward New York. That peaceful moment ended abruptly 3 hours into the flight when Madison was awakened by a sound she recognized from her military training: the distinctive whistle of incoming missiles cutting through the air at supersonic speed. Her eyes snapped open immediately, and she looked around the cabin to see if other passengers had heard the sound. Most seemed unaware, continuing their conversations, reading or sleeping. But Madison's combat experience had trained her to recognize threats that civilian ears might miss. The first missile detonated against the aircraft's left engine with a tremendous explosion that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. Emergency oxygen masks deployed immediately as the cabin depressurized, and passengers began screaming as they realized something catastrophic had happened. Madison's training kicked in automatically. Even before the flight attendants could begin their emergency procedures, she was assessing the tactical situation, understanding that civilian aircraft under attack required immediate response from anyone with relevant expertise. The second missile struck the aircraft's right wing, causing additional structural damage and creating multiple system failures that would challenge even experienced airline pilots. Through her window, Madison could see flames streaming from damaged engines and sections of wing that had been torn away by the explosions. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Johnson," came the urgent announcement over the intercom, though his voice was strained and interrupted by the sound of alarms in the cockpit. "We have experienced catastrophic system failures and are beginning emergency descent procedures. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing." Madison understood immediately that Flight 847 was facing a survival situation that would test every aspect of aviation training and emergency procedures. The civilian passengers around her were panicking, many crying and praying as they realized their aircraft was severely damaged and potentially going down. But Madison also understood that panic was counterproductive in emergency situations, and that someone with her training needed to remain calm and focused on solutions rather than dwelling on the magnitude of the crisis. "Is anyone on board with aviation experience?" came the announcement from the head flight attendant, speaking over the cabin address system with barely controlled desperation. "We need immediate assistance in the cockpit." Madison unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, making her way toward the front of the aircraft despite the turbulence and debris that made movement difficult. Other passengers grabbed at her, asking questions and seeking reassurance, but Madison focused on reaching the cockpit where her expertise might make the difference between survival and disaster. "I'm a military pilot," Madison announced to the flight attendant who had made the announcement. "I can help with emergency procedures and aircraft control." The flight attendant looked at Madison with a mixture of hope and skepticism, seeing a young woman in civilian clothes who claimed capabilities that might save 200 lives or might represent false hope during their worst crisis. "Ma'am, I need to verify your qualifications before I can allow you into the cockpit," the flight attendant said, following protocols that seemed absurd under current circumstances. "My name is Captain Madison Carter, United States Air Force, pilot qualification in multiple aircraft types, including emergency procedures for catastrophic system failures," Madison replied, with the authority that came from years of command responsibility. "Right now, I'm the most qualified person on this aircraft to assist your pilots with the situation we're facing." The flight attendant made the decision that would determine whether Flight 847's passengers survived the next hour. "Follow me to the cockpit immediately." Madison entered the flight deck to find Captain Johnson and First Officer Sarah Martinez fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was experiencing multiple system failures simultaneously. Both pilots were conscious, but showed signs of injury from the missile impacts, cuts from flying debris, and evidence of the physical stress that came from wrestling with aircraft controls that no longer responded predictably. "Captain Johnson, I'm Captain Carter, Air Force pilot," Madison announced. "What's your current status?" "We've lost both engines. Hydraulic systems are failing. Flight controls are barely responding," Captain Johnson replied, his voice tight with the stress of trying to fly an aircraft that was rapidly becoming unflyable. "We're losing altitude, and I'm not sure we can maintain controlled flight much longer." Madison looked at the instrument panel, quickly assessing the extent of system damage and calculating options for emergency landing. Her military training had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario, multiple system failures in hostile environments requiring innovative solutions under extreme time pressure. "Captain, What's your experience with dead stick landings and emergency procedures for total system failure? Madison asked. We trained for single-engine failure and some hydraulic problems. But nothing like this, First Officer Martinez replied. We've never dealt with total engine loss and multiple system failures simultaneously. Madison understood that civilian airline training, while comprehensive, focused on scenarios that were statistically likely rather than the extreme situations that military pilots trained for routinely. Combat aviation required preparation for aircraft damage that exceeded what commercial aviation typically encountered. I need to assess our options, Madison said, studying the navigation displays to determine their current position and identify potential landing sites within their remaining flight envelope. The aircraft was approximately 400 miles from the nearest suitable airport, losing altitude at a rate that made reaching conventional landing facilities impossible with current glide performance. Madison calculated that they had perhaps 15 minutes of controlled flight remaining before the aircraft became completely uncontrollable. But Madison's combat experience had taught her to think creatively about emergency landing sites that civilian pilots might not consider. Military training emphasized that any reasonably flat surface could serve as a runway if approach procedures were modified to account for unconventional landing environments. Captain Johnson, there's a military airbase approximately 180 miles northeast of our current position, Madison said, studying the tactical navigation display. It's within our glide range if we optimize our flight path and energy management. That's MacDill Air Force Base, Captain Johnson replied. But we don't have clearance for military installation approach, and I'm not qualified for military field landing procedures. I am, Madison said. With your permission, I'd like to take primary flight controls and execute an emergency approach to MacDill. Your commercial aviation experience combined with my military emergency procedures training gives us the best chance of getting everyone on the ground safely. Captain Johnson looked at Madison, recognizing that their conventional options had been exhausted and that innovative solutions were required to save the lives of everyone on board. Captain Carter, you have flight controls, Johnson said, relinquishing primary pilot authority to someone whose training might be better suited to their current crisis. Madison took control of Flight 847, immediately implementing emergency procedures that combined civilian aircraft capabilities with military approach techniques designed for damaged aircraft operating under combat conditions. Her first priority was establishing communication with MacDill Air Force Base to coordinate emergency landing procedures and ensure that appropriate rescue equipment would be positioned for their arrival. MacDill Tower, this is United Flight 847 declaring emergency, Madison transmitted over military frequencies. We are a civilian Boeing 767 with catastrophic system damage requesting immediate emergency landing clearance. United 847, MacDill Tower. State the nature of your emergency and pilot qualifications for military field approach. MacDill, we were attacked by hostile missiles resulting in total engine loss and multiple system failures. I am Captain Madison Carter, Air Force pilot, currently controlling the aircraft. We have 200 souls on board and approximately 10 minutes of controlled flight remaining. The response from MacDill Tower reflected the urgency of coordinating an emergency landing for a damaged civilian aircraft at a military installation that wasn't equipped for commercial aviation operations. Captain Carter, you are cleared for immediate emergency approach to runway 06. All emergency equipment is being positioned. Be advised that runway length is 11,000 feet with military approach lighting. Madison began her approach to MacDill Air Force Base using procedures that combined her knowledge of civilian aircraft performance with military emergency landing techniques designed for damaged aircraft with compromised flight controls. The approach required precise energy management to ensure the aircraft reached the runway with sufficient airspeed for landing while avoiding excessive speed that could result in runway overrun with failed braking systems. Captain Johnson, I need you to coordinate with the cabin crew for emergency landing procedures, Madison said while maintaining focus on the approach profile. Passengers need to be prepared for hard landing and potential evacuation. Already in progress, Captain Johnson replied. Flight attendants are briefing passengers on brace positions and evacuation procedures. Madison could hear the announcements being made throughout the cabin, instructing passengers on emergency procedures while trying to maintain calm despite the obvious severity of their situation. Over the aircraft's intercom system, she could hear the professional voices of flight attendants explaining brace positions, location of emergency exits, and evacuation procedures that everyone hoped wouldn't be necessary, but that could save lives if the landing went wrong. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching our emergency landing," came the announcement from the head flight attendant. "Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened, assume brace positions, and listen carefully for evacuation instructions." Madison lined up Flight 847 with MacDill's main runway, using visual approach techniques that she had learned during military training for situations where instrument systems were unreliable or completely failed. The aircraft's glide performance was degraded due to structural damage, requiring steeper approach angles than normal civilian procedures would recommend. But Madison's combat flying experience had taught her to adapt standard procedures to accommodate aircraft damage that challenged conventional flight envelope limitations. "MacDill Tower, Flight 847 on final approach. Emergency equipment standing by." "Flight 847, all emergency response teams positioned. Runway is clear, winds calm, visibility unlimited. You are cleared to land." Madison executed the emergency landing using techniques that combined civilian aircraft handling characteristics with military precision approach procedures designed for maximum safety margins under adverse conditions. The Boeing 767 touched down hard but within acceptable parameters, immediately beginning deceleration as Madison applied maximum braking while maintaining directional control on an aircraft whose systems were barely functional. Emergency vehicles raced alongside the aircraft as it rolled down the runway, prepared to respond immediately if fire or other complications developed during the landing rollout. Flight 847 came to a complete stop, approximately 7,000 feet down the runway, having successfully completed an emergency landing that saved the lives of all 200 passengers and crew members despite catastrophic damage that would have been unsurvivable without immediate expert intervention. "MacDill Tower, United 847 is on the ground and secure. All souls on board are safe," Madison transmitted as emergency personnel surrounded the aircraft. The evacuation proceeded according to standard procedures, with all passengers and crew evacuated within 6 minutes of landing. Medical personnel treated Captain Johnson and First Officer Martinez for injuries sustained during the missile attack, but both pilots made full recoveries. Madison found herself surrounded by Air Force personnel who recognized her name and reputation within the military aviation community. Her emergency landing of a damaged civilian aircraft had demonstrated skills that would be analyzed and studied by aviation safety experts for years to come. "Captain Carter, outstanding performance under impossible conditions," said Colonel Michael Thompson, MacDill's base commander. "You saved 200 lives today." "Sir, I was just applying the training the Air Force gave me. Captain Johnson and First Officer Martinez maintained control under circumstances that would have challenged anyone." 3 hours later, Madison received a secured phone call that would end her vacation permanently. "Captain Carter, this is General Patricia Morrison, Air Combat Command," came the voice over the encrypted connection. "I understand you've had an eventful day." "Yes, ma'am. Flight 847 was attacked by hostile missiles, but we managed to land safely with no casualties." "Captain, intelligence reports indicate the missiles that attacked your flight were launched by the same terrorist organization that has been targeting civilian aircraft in international airspace. We need pilots with your expertise to track down and eliminate these threats before they kill innocent people." Madison understood immediately what General Morrison was requesting. Her vacation was over, and she was being recalled to active duty for missions that would require her most advanced combat skills. "Ma'am, I'm ready to return to operational status immediately." "Captain Carter, report to Langley Air Force Base within 24 hours for mission briefing." This is classified at the highest levels, and success will require pilots who can think creatively under pressure. The next day, Madison found herself in a secured briefing room receiving intelligence about terrorist organizations that had acquired advanced surface-to-air missiles and were using them to target civilian aircraft in international airspace. The attacks were coordinated, sophisticated, and designed to create maximum psychological impact by demonstrating that commercial aviation was vulnerable to terrorist actions that governments seemed unable to prevent. Captain Carter, your mission is to locate and eliminate the terrorist cells responsible for these attacks, General Morrison explained. You'll be flying modified F-16s equipped with advanced sensors and precision weapons designed for this specific threat. Over the next 6 months, Madison led missions that systematically dismantled the terrorist network responsible for attacking Flight 847. The operations were conducted in international airspace and foreign territories, using tactics that combined air-to-air combat with precision strikes against ground targets. Each mission eliminated portions of the terrorist organization while gathering intelligence that led to additional targets. Madison's experience saving civilian lives during the Flight 847 emergency had provided motivation that drove her to ensure no other innocent people would face similar threats. The terrorist network had been more extensive than initial intelligence had indicated, with cells operating in multiple countries and coordination that suggested state sponsorship from hostile nations seeking to disrupt Western commercial aviation through plausible deniability. Madison's missions required her to operate in contested airspace where enemy air defense systems posed constant threats to American aircraft. Her combat experience and tactical expertise proved invaluable in environments where conventional military operations would have been too risky or politically sensitive. The final mission eliminated the terrorist leadership and destroyed their remaining missile inventory, effectively ending their capability to threaten civilian aviation. Flight 847's passengers never learned the identity of the military pilot who had saved their lives. But Madison's actions that day had protected not only the 200 people on board, but thousands of future travelers who would fly safely because terrorist threats had been eliminated. The emergency landing at MacDill Air Force Base became a case study taught in both civilian and military aviation training programs, demonstrating how individual expertise could overcome seemingly impossible situations when applied with courage and precision. Madison returned to routine fighter pilot duties after completing her counterterrorism missions, but she carried with her the knowledge that military training served purposes beyond conventional combat operations. Sometimes the most important missions were the ones that protected innocent people from threats they never knew existed, executed by pilots whose names would never appear in headlines, but whose actions ensured that commercial aviation remained safe for families traveling to visit loved ones. Madison Carter had started her vacation as a passenger on Flight 847. She had ended it as the pilot who brought everyone home safely, then returned to active duty to ensure the people responsible never threatened civilians again. Some emergencies required technical skills, others required courage. The best outcomes required both, applied by people who understood that protecting others was worth any personal sacrifice. The terrorists who had tried to murder 200 innocent civilians learned that attacking Americans meant facing consequences delivered by pilots trained to find and eliminate threats wherever they existed. Madison's emergency landing had saved lives. Her subsequent missions had saved countless others by ensuring the threat was eliminated permanently. The sky was vast enough for both commercial airliners carrying families to their destinations and military aircraft ensuring those families arrived safely. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.